I was asked to present on some of my contemporary research, but also to contextualize it within my larger trajectory. And so what I'm going to do today is I have two parts to this talk. The first part is a presentation of myself and my trajectory, some of my previous projects that, as you will see, work into my current work, which has been, I've been looking at some of these topics since 1991, really, and one project feeds into another in a variety of ways. And then in the second half, I will be reading what is currently a work in progress, Death is No Exception, an introduction to a paper that I'm preparing for submission to probably the Annals of the Association of American Geographers. So I'm going to do all of this in 45 minutes, and that leaves plenty of time for questions. So anything that I leave off, things that are unclear, I'm really looking forward to the comments. So this is, this first slide really is to give you a sense of how I present myself in my trajectory, sort of in a larger sense. And the four projects that I feel are most indicative of my arc of my work. The first, disposable women and global factories. The second, social movements on the border, public women fighting feminicidio. And the third, which is a project I'm currently working on in collaboration with a colleague at the Autonomous University in Ciudad Juarez, Hector Padilla, and a colleague at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, British Columbia, sorry, Juanita Sundberg, that just came out. Every time I see militarization, I think of the Americas, that Colombia just pops out of my mouth. So that's that third project that is currently, we're currently working on that still. And then my fourth project, which I'm thinking through out of some of this work that we're doing in this third project, we're really thinking about some of the challenges in social movements in Mexico today, and I was inspired by an activist hashtag in 2014 after the assault and the massacre and disappearance of the Normalista students, the rural student teachers, the hashtag of Ayotzinapa-Ferguson, to really, and I looked at that as an opportunity to think through the coupling, the theoretical and political possibilities of putting these places, the events that we associate with them, the larger significance of them, their historical and geographic context, really thinking those through together. And so I will be presenting on that work today, which is, as I said, speculative as I'm thinking this, thinking in these terms. So this was my first project, started out of graduate school. I did many months of and years of ethnographic work for this, starting in 1991, had NSF, I was a fellowship, and then various forms of support for this. And I looked at these themes after really being able to get my analysis together through the process of writing the dissertation and then publishing out of the dissertation. And I looked at different dimensions in different points in time and developed some ideas more than others. My book, Disposable Women and Other Myths of Global Capital, comes out of, you can see various bits of this, but really thinking about how are power and resistance conceived of and exercised in the factory setting. What are their relationships to the forces outside of factories, thinking about corporate location strategies and border landscapes, as I was able to do some comparative work in northern Mexico inside some of the same corporations that were setting up in southern China and in Hong Kong. And as I'm working on this, I'm thinking also about what does it mean to be conducting multi-sided ethnography. I was a scholar of Mexico, had been trained really to study Mexico since I was an undergraduate, and had never studied anything about China, very little about Asia, felt really ill-qualified as a regional specialist. So what did it mean to be doing a comparative study? And so I focused in on what it is that I did recognize, which were certain kinds of factory systems. And so there were certain similarities, certain kind of some structural components there, but within many differences. And so I discussed some of the limitations to being able to do that kind of work, but also how it is that there are certain kinds of structural processes that allow for that kind of work to be done as well. I also connected the feminization of the labor force with the feminization of urban space in urban areas, really focusing in on Ciudad Juarez at this point, and some of the urban dynamics really around the idea of feminization. And then the idea of really looking at this as a critical study of global capitalism. How were disposable laborers produced? How was this beneficial to a system that relies on a constant supply of labor that works at very high produces very high quality? So these are some of the topics that I explore further, particularly in the book. So I don't have a pointer. Think about that. Anyway, so this project is up in the Pearl River Delta area here. Ciudad Juarez, El Paso there. I also was down in Chihuahua some. So that's where that project was really located. As I said, I was focusing on what I could recognize as familiar, but there was much that I wasn't able to do, and I really focused in as an urban geographer in the city of Juarez, particularly, and really thinking about the different urban landscapes that were developing or were transforming in relation to some of those topics that I was looking at. Some of the publications out of this, I just show you just to give you a sense of some of the articles in the book, book chapters, other articles out of this work. I had book chapters in these, just you know, the interdisciplinary aspect of my publications. The second project, I really started focusing then on social movements. I got out of the factory context, out of the real corporate ethnographic work that I was doing. And this also came out of my work. My first academic position was actually at the Autonomous University in Ciudad Juarez in the mid-1990s, where I was working as I was finishing up my dissertation at Hopkins. I just moved to Juarez and El Paso and was living one point in one city and one point in another city. And I was working in the Institute of Social Sciences and helping to develop the Master's in Social Sciences and the Gender Studies program at the university, and had what was a wonderful opportunity for me to really be involved in the growing social movements around violence against women and the politicization of violence against women, and the argument that a woman's safety was a matter of public safety. This was really, you know, what this movement was. Started off as a municipal movement, as a movement of activists going and family members going to the mayor of a city, and then it changed scales. And so as a geographer, really thinking through the multi-scalar aspects of social movements and what that means for the kinds of justice claims it can make, for the kinds of alliances that develop, for the actual concrete outcomes. So, for example, in that first meeting with the mayor, that the activists who went were talking about street lighting and better bus transportation. That's a very municipal kind of set of issues. As the campaign started to develop and it becomes a matter of maybe changing state legislation or federal legislation or the idea of human rights, then you have other kinds of claims that become part of the concrete part of movements. But thinking about how these local demands and these local networks connect with networks working at other scales was something that I was really focusing on. I also was have put a lot of time into thinking about the word feminicidio and the power of this word. It's become a very powerful tool, a very useful tool, a very strategic tool for bringing attention to not only the idea of violence against women, but the impunity within it. So it's a word that developed out of a collaboration of feminist scholars based in Mexico, two in particular, who used this Anglophone word, femicide, and in translating it and applying it in their scholarship that then became used as part of as a variety of activist campaigns, the word feminicidio changed the meaning of femicide, because within feminicidio is a critique of the state. It's a critique of impunity. And that has created a concept that isn't just a new word in Spanish, feminicidio. It has completely transformed the whole idea of femicide itself. And so this term is now a codified term. It's a term that's part of the legal code now in Mexico. It's a term that is used in international judicial settings, the Inter-American Human Rights Court, the United Nations. So really thinking about the technologies of social movements, of course, the language of social movements, the concepts, how they change, and the geographic components to that is what I've looked at a lot. I've looked also at the idea of public women, public space, and democracy in Mexico in a context in which you say la mujer pública, the public woman, is a way to say prostitute. If you say el hombre público, the public man, it's a way to say citizen. This is not unique to Mexico. This is actually, as feminist scholars have shown, part of modern liberal democratic societies and regimes of governance. But in this context, in these words, you can really see this contrast. And this plays out very much in urban space, in public space. So that the disqualification of a woman's worth because she's in the public is a way, obviously, disqualifying all women from democracy, right? So really thinking about these social movements that brought attention to these many contradictions and to the inherent exclusions within these ways of thinking and governing is something I thought a lot about. Then, as the so-called drug wars and the official war on drugs started gaining steam in Mexico, it turned my attention to the work, Shilma Bimbe's work, and other work really thinking about necropolitics, governance through death, the kind of complement and expansion and critique, but still working with Michel Foucault's ideas on biopolitics and governance, but really saying we really need to think more about the examples presented by the Global South, the non-Northern, North American, Western European examples that really demonstrate the complexities of governance that isn't about only the reproduction of life, but about the reproduction of death in very strategic ways. And here, thinking about this connection between the governance of corpses and death in relation to narcopolitics, which is the criminalization of an informal economy, and in a neoliberal political economic situation in which the informal economy is the economy that is expanding, really thinking about this kind of governance strategy and how social movements address this. I had NSF and Fulbright funding various points for this work. So these are some of the campaigns I was looking at. This picture on the bottom is from 2004. These are the women in black, las mujeres de negro from Chihuahua, who I spent some time with and interviewed and have written a fair amount about in their activism. Just really thinking also about some of the regional differences, again, getting to the scales of movements and the networks. Thinking also about the iconography of the movement. This is figuring more in my current reflections on Death is No Exception. Really, how do you create the presence of disappeared people? How do you create their corporality? What is the embodiment of disappearance? And in this movement, the use of the cross, particularly a pink cross, either a black cross on a pink background or pink crosses, which is the feminization of the original, or one of the most original, I'll go there, most original symbols of the phallus. You know, the symbol of the father is the cross. To make it pink, to feminize it in this way and put this in the landscape is a very interesting, very potentially radical, you could say radical, within, though, a shifting terrain of radicality. So just, again, thinking through what are the tools, the strategies, what are the discourses that make sense under certain circumstances, and how do activists work with that? So some of my contributions here, these are edited collections that I helped co-edit. These are some of I have chapters in these books, edited or co-edited by others. I can't take credit for the covers. And then some of the articles. So the third project, militarization, security, and La Vida Fronteriza, the border life. This is the project I mentioned at the beginning, collaboration with Hector Padilla and Juanita Sundberg. We have funding from NSF, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada, and then the Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez, the Autonomous University in Ciudad Juárez. And this is a project we started in 2010, which was a very tricky year to start this project in Juárez. This is where we started it. Our base really is the university in Juárez, and that we've gotten a tremendous amount of in-kind support there. More or less our lab is there. That's where we typically meet when we're working this out. And in 2010, that's when Juárez was being governed essentially and patrolled by about 13,000 federal elements between the military and the federal police. In 2008, the military had come in and taken over the operations of the local police. A retired military personnel or former member of the military, retired, had taken over many of the operations of their functions of the mayor, a democratically elected mayor who's just kind of slid over. And the police were decommissioned, and then in 2010 the federal police came in and took over some of those functions from the military. The military occupied certain physical areas of the city, and the federal police occupied other physical areas of the city, and they shared those governance structures for a few years. And so we started this project at this time, and we ended up slowing down the timeline of the project, and we'll be completing it in this fall, because we felt that we really needed to, we were running into some issues, more issues of trauma than we had initially been prepared for methodologically, so we had to rework some of our methodological approaches, but also to take some time to really think about what's going on in relation to these topics that we're looking at. La Vida Fronteriza, this aspect is very critical to the project. This is a map I got from actually a Texas Water, the State of Texas Water Commission. I thought it was an interesting way of showing the idea of the border. I mean, we could talk about that. But the project is in the two Nogaleses and in Ciudad Juárez, El Paso. But it's not a truly comparative project in the sense of all areas are given the same treatment. Juárez has gotten more attention from us for a variety of reasons, although we have conducted extensive research in these areas. And one of the questions within the project is, what is happening to the idea of La Vida Fronteriza, the border life, as an identity, as the idea of communities, the idea of experience of place? How has an identity that has been arguably, for some communities, a coherent part of identity, that is, the border is a part of a coherency, that's something that, a place that is a meeting point not only of communities and of families and where differences meet, but also of an integral sense of self. Soy una fronteriza. I am a border person. How does that identity change, or how is it affected in a context in which the border is very dramatically and very aggressively treated as a place of absolute divide? and in which to approach it in any other way actually can be a criminal offense. That the assumption of difference is the de facto assumption under the legal code and is being enforced through various militarized techniques. So really thinking about this in relation to the various projects for creating public security in the name of national security, and what's the relation between national security to public safety. How do we think of the public in this sense? Is there a conceptualization of the public that extends, that can, a public that is the border public? Is there a way in which that can be sustained? So there's a very vast literature that we're going to be working with, that we've been thinking about as we've been working with this project, but we've also really been very embedded in the actual fieldwork itself. Conducting interviews and focus groups with over 300 people in various points, and usually more than once, doing some various collective mapping exercises, and I'll show you some of that. So again, these are some of the events we're thinking about. This is the federal police arriving in 2010. This is then the retraining and remodeling and remaking of the municipal police trained by the federal police, then under Julian Lezaola, who had been brought in from Tijuana to oversee the reintegration of a municipal police force, a professionalized police force. So this is the professionalized police force through all of this. And so we've been, looking at this particular transformation. These are other ways also of thinking about these dynamics. Downtown Juarez connecting into downtown El Paso through the old bridge, and looking at changes, particularly in downtown Juarez. That's one of my particular emphases in this project, is really thinking about changes to the Centro Histórico, the downtown area. This is the Grupo Beta, the military, the Mexican military personnel who receive people who have been deported, that is forcibly re-entered into Mexico in Nogales or in Sonora. And so that's a military group that is tasked with a humanitarian mission. So really thinking also about this as militarization, right? What is this role? And of course, this is not unique to Mexico, right? The United States is also very involved in its humanitarian missions. So this is as a military responsibility. So thinking that through. Also the spaces of tourism, the U.S. military base, the German military base. There's also other ways of thinking about militarization and tourism and consumption in this vida fronteriza. We've got a lot of things that we want to write about, a lot of projects, writing projects that we're getting going. Some of the topics that we've identified is really thinking about, and as we're working through a tremendous amount of data still. So mobility, fear, and belonging, really thinking about this in relation to La Vida Fronteriza, security in the Americas, really putting together this long trajectory, and of course the U.S. domestic war on drugs, I think, really belongs. Here, I mean, Kissinger and Nixon were quite the team when we're thinking about domestic drug wars and wars on drugs with international wars on drugs as well, particularly in the Americas. Civilian versus militarized public space. So what is it to militarize a civilian police force? How do we think about the relationship between the public and the military, between the military and the non-military? What is a non-military in this context? So how do people understand this? And so one of the questions we're looking at is what are the different ideas and manifestations of militarization that people are encountering, particularly on the Mexican side? There's a lot written about this for the U.S. side as well, and we're getting into that to some extent, but really we're developing this more on the Mexican side. The mixed methodologies and map making, I'll talk to you about that in a minute. These two are my particular projects that I'm also working on in relation to this, the defeminization of Juarez. It's really something very interesting that's come out of a lot of the interviews, and a paper that I'm working on now is coming out of an interview with a woman who, in her late 30s at the time, this interview occurred in 2012, a school teacher at a junior high in Juarez, and she was talking about her sadness that she would not allow her daughter, who was at that point a 16-year-old girl, to go out with her friends at night and go dancing until 1 or 2 in the morning as she had. And I found this to be quite an interesting conversation within a discussion of what good motherhood looks like. Right, here's a woman saying, I'm really sad that my daughter is not out with her friends at 1 or 2 in the morning. I'm sad for her. Now, how many moms of teenage girls say, my daughter won't go out, she's always at home by midnight? And I found this to be quite a revelation. And so, I mean, it says something about me, I think, but given how much I've studied this, but that, we talked a lot about this and the sadness and nostalgia and the sense of loss of access. That's what she's talking about, loss of access that women and girls have. And this has come up a great deal in our interviews, and I'll show you a little bit on the mapping. So, looking at this also coincides with a gentrification project. Well, I better start talking faster. A gentrification project in downtown Juarez that I'm also looking at, and I've written a bit about, which I also link with the defeminization of urban space. I have a research assistant, Leonardo Alvarado, who's been working on this with us. He's wonderful at the UACJ. He's working with me now on mapping out the disappearance of LGBTQ working spaces and working class bars, the very bars that I, as a young lesbian, went to when I was a teenager in my early 20s. Many of them are gone now from the downtown. They're not part of the renovation project. And so he's doing an oral history and really kind of creating a map of this also that I think is going to be, I'm really excited about it. But that's not directly linked into the group project, but it's coming out of it. So now, for the cartographers in the room, just hold on. These are our attempts to really think about how to work with some of this data and how to create this graphically. We all took a week-long crash course in ArcGIS. All of us, and this was in Juarez, and really trying to, because we were doing these collective mappings, because as we were dealing with trauma, we realized we couldn't be interviewing people. We couldn't get verbal responses to some of our questions and some of the topics because they were just too painful. We also would fall apart during these interviews. So we decided, for the sake of everybody, let's get people to draw, make things a little bit more fun, lighten it up, and see if we can get some data that way. So we put maps of the city up on the wall, and everybody had different colored stickers, and they'd run around, and we'd have questions like, where do you feel safe, where do you feel unsafe, where did you go, where did you used to go, you don't go anymore, where do you feel safe but you still have to go to, those kinds of questions. Where do you experience militarization, where do you, that kind of stuff. And they would put these dots on these maps, and then we worked with these maps. And then they had a questionnaire that they would fill out, and they'd have their own personal maps. So these were quite involved exercises, and we're mashing it all together and coming up with different kinds of documents and this is wrong. These are, as I said, should be 2010 to 2014, and some of the data have different historical moments. So I know it's not perfect, but so this is just to give you a sense. I've got to go through these quickly, but we can come back to their questions. The downtown area and the Pronaf area, which was a particular development zone, are hot areas here in this entire, as well as the valley, which was a tourist leisure area. And so what you see is that there's a tremendous amount of, the city got smaller, but from principal areas of very critical areas of the city. I mean, smaller in terms of experience. People don't go there anymore, that kind of thing. We saw gender differences. One of the things that women said very clearly, they didn't feel like they felt like the militarization was everywhere, that they couldn't escape it. The men had a different, as a group, had said that there were certain areas that they could avoid. And we thought this was very interesting. This indicates that women have a little bit less flexibility about where they can go. They're usually, if they're going to the grocery store, if they're going to pick up a kid, if they're going to work, they can't change their trajectory. Men have a little bit more flexibility, this is not news, more flexibility in their access and use of urban space and the choices they can make. So there were some differences in gender that you would anticipate, but there were also very noticeable and interesting differences in senses of safety and lack of safety. Men felt less secure in more areas than women, and again, this has something to do with access, but it's very interesting. The written responses provide something. These are some things that we keep in mind. It's not a typo, and this is just kind of also thinking about changing landscapes as the cemeteries are filling up with youth corpses and the actual physicality of death in an industry that grew by that magnitude. So the physicality, the landscape, the geography of these events. This was the day that the President Enrique Peña Nieto went to Juarez to declare that things were better. So I have contributed a couple of chapters here, but we are really still working through the data. I was just there 3 weeks ago, and I think we're going to get it going. So, democracy and disappearance. These are, again, some of the things I've been bearing in mind. You can start seeing, hopefully, you'll be able to see the kind of the continuities across these projects. Thinking about, okay, the March Against Feminicidio, but also in relation to the mobilizations for the students that have been provoked by this particular set of events from September 2014, when these students were taken by government agents, some of them killed beforehand along with other people on the street, and then they've not been seen again. The mobilizations provoked and sparked by the government's response in addition to the events themselves. And then the different ways of protest have been expressed, and again, this gets to the embodiment of disappearance. What is the iconography? How is disappearance given a physicality? How are disappeared people made present in place? And so the numbering, the use of the body as a billboard is given a number. There was also many episodes of full frontal nudes or full nudes in like the metro and public space, particularly by women. And really thinking about that as a political strategy and the vulnerability of activists in a very vulnerable situation. Okay, I'm going to go quickly because I have something to read to you. So these are some of the issues I'm thinking about. I have something in press that is my first piece on this. And I'm going to say this quickly. I really also like to think about the transition. So this is a normal for young women. These are male students from a normal, that is a teacher's college. Some of their revolutionary, this comes out of, these colleges come out of the rural revolutionary period. But the creation of a protester, right? How do you go from student to activist? And really thinking about then, again, the embodiment of this, the corporal practice of protest. Thinking about young men's bodies from Guerrero, right? Some of the iconography, the idea, the way that Guerrero is known in Mexico. This is Acapulco here. The young men diving, still a major tourist attraction. Acapulco is the #1 major tourist destination for residents of Mexico City. Young men's bodies, also from the state of Guerrero. These are some of the students who were killed. This one here had his face skinned and his eyes gouged out while he was alive. This is Elena Poniatowska addressing the crowd, the protest in October of 2014 when she says, "Return them." And thinking about, this was a moment also I was really thinking about, what is the return to? And I'm thinking about this, to return to a kind of a political life. But a life actually that, a political life that wasn't really accessible by these young men in their lives. They were part of, marginalized, rural, indigenous, poor communities who are not part of the Mexican future. And she declares, what is a country that what is the future of a country that kills its students? And she's, integrating these young men into an imaginary of the student activists, the students or revolutionaries since 1968, it's a very important figure in Mexico. But these young men hadn't been considered part of Mexico's future and hadn't been centered to the political project of the country in their lives because they're part of marginalized communities. So really thinking about this is what I'm considering. The embodiment, their representation as students missing. So you can imagine their physicality here. They took them alive, we want them alive, even if they're dead, is the other part of this. And these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, okay? Thinking about cartographies here, and I could maybe get some questions about that. And then these are some of my student projects, but I'm going to now start reading to you, and I will talk to you about those other things. I'm going to leave it here.